Welcome to another Northern Monkeys video. This time we're looking at the detachments and leaders that you can take for Space Marine Eradicators. So Eradicators were introduced at the start of 9th edition as part of the starter set, quickly got their own multi-part plastic kit, and were kind of a menace throughout that entire edition, back before the toughness statistics all went up across the board. Melter guns were kind of where it was at in terms of anti-tank. And these guys used to have a cool rule where they doubled their number of shots if they were firing into a single target. Really, really powerful. They've changed a lot since then, and I still think they have a place in 10th edition, but they've definitely changed and aren't the default for Space Marines these days. So looking at these guys' stats, they're not that assuming really. 100 points for 3, or 200 points for 6. It's on the more expensive side of Space Marine squads. They're on the par with aggressors now these days, and aggressors have a very powerful melee component to their kit. But still, being a gravis marine, it's not a bad thing. 3 wounds and toughness 6 kind of lets them stand up to small arms fire pretty well, unless they have lethal hits, like las guns and that sort of style of weapon aren't doing anything to these guys. And they're being wounded on 5s by a lot of things, even in melee. Stuff like power swords and the like. They've got some interesting weapons here. They obviously all have these melter rifles. They're their standard loadout, one shot. It's essentially a melter gun with 18 inches of range, which is notable because it means that you can't come in from strategic reserves and get inside of melter range because you have to be more than 9 away. However, they do have the ever so powerful multi-melter, which, while it hits a little bit worse, is still an additional shot. So, you look at this unit, it's okay, it's gravis guys, but it's 100 points and they just have some melter gun shots. It's not really going to get anything done off these raw stats, which I think it's always worth looking at a data sheet and taking the whole thing in. So this is where it's really at for Eradicators. Total obliteration. It's their ability. Each time they make a ranged attack that targets a monster or a vehicle model, you can reroll the hit, wound, and damage roll. Really, really strong. Now, when I saw this originally, I almost missed the last part of it because I was like, oh wow, full rerolls to hit and wound. Really strong. But notably, it's also damage. Now, this is an ability that we've sort of seen come up more and more in the game. I think Fire Dragons were given it, and I'm sure there's something else out there that someone who knows the game a bit better would be able to call out. But it's a very, very strong ability, and it really, really makes the unit. Now, these guys are essentially, without this ability, these guys are 4 melter gun shots. Not really that dangerous, just because they're going to be wounding most vehicles on 5+. So you just barely get, even if you do hit every single shot, you're probably only going to do a single wound. But with this, it just really takes their damage threshold right up there. Especially with the multi-melter, they get 4 shots out of this unit, 4 rerolls to hit and wound. You're just going to punch something through with that AP4 that you've got. That's like the strength of the melter gun, is that high AP. And then getting to reroll the damage. A d6 damage is just all over the place, but having that free reroll built into it, really, really, really good. Just gives you that chance to be like, even if you're not in melter range, you can just be like, oh yeah, take 5 damage out of this. Like, on average, that's what you're going to get out of these kind of guns. And if you get multiple shots through, if you get a bit lucky, then you're really, really singing. And these guys are kind of dangerous because there's always that potential that you're just going to kind of one-shot a 11, 12 wound vehicle out of nowhere with this squad. So it's quite good. And don't forget as well, because they've got these full rerolls baked in, there's a few like little tricks to that. They don't need Oath of Moment. You can be using your Oath of Moment to like buff up your Blade Guard or something else in your army that needs it a lot more. And these guys can just be on their own, kind of targeting a vehicle or a monster and taking it out. So it's really, really good as that kind of independence, where they're like more of a scalpel than a hammer in terms of a Space Marine datasheet. And also, it's worth noting, while it's very unreliable, this ability procs anytime they make a ranged attack, which means it procs when this unit overwatches. Really, really nice, because you're just going to have that chance to, anytime an enemy vehicle sort of moves around you, you've just got that roll 4 dice, roll them again. The chances are you're going to get 1, maybe 2 if you're lucky, shots through. And then you've always got that chance to just do big damage to enemies. It can be really, really... it can give your opponent something to think about and give you that chance to kind of just get a spike of damage out of nowhere. Which, especially one of the big complaints about Space Marines, is they have way too much command points. So just having this unit with a chance to do that, it's quite good. So in terms of the loadout, there's only really one thing you can do with this squad, and that's putting a multi-melter in them. I think this is always worth doing. Even hitting on 4s, it's still better because not only is it double the number of shots, so I think just on basic stats it's even better, but the rerolls factor in a lot more here and just make it so that you're really, really going to be wanting to take this multi-melter. I've found since I did a little bit of a conversion and started running it this way, it's been absolutely really made the squad go from something that was so swingy to something that I can kind of see myself relying on. So yeah, definitely take the multi-melter on these guys, it adds a lot. So in our previous video, one of the monkeys talked about doing little conversions and getting yourself started. And I think if you're looking for the first time to right, I'm going to chop up a model and change something about it, this is one of the easiest ones out there. If you can find a friend who used to collect Space Marines, maybe they've got a multi-melter bit hanging about, and all you need to do is take a scalpel, carefully remove the barrels from the weapon, and then attach the multi-melter bits in place. It's a very, very simple, very, very easy conversion, and it's always worth doing from a rules perspective, as far as I'm concerned. Now, in terms of what detachment you want to put these guys in, I'd say you've got a good spread of them to go for. They're very, very detachment agnostic. They just kind of work well in almost anything. If you're looking to add a little bit of anti-tank punch to your army without pumping for a whole tank like the Lancer, or one of the Predator tanks with the las cannons, I think these guys are really, really, really worth going for. Now, they can sort of slot them into anything, they get bonuses everywhere. The durability from Vanguard Spearhead, this is a big one, the -1 to be hit and cover save at ranged attacks. That's nice for kind of staging these guys, keeping them safe before they can get up there and really deal a punch to your opponent. That also has a cool stratagem that gives you +1 to hit and +1 AP, which, takes these Eradicators into the super accurate territory, and means that you're even a 2-up save opponent, as long as they don't have cover, wouldn't be getting any kind of a save against these guys. Genuinely really strong, and could be a piece for going in the Vanguard Spearhead detachment. Gladius Task Force, I feel like there should just be a Gladius Task Force section to all Space Marine videos because it's so dominant and so good. Advance and Shoot from their Devastator Doctrine, really, really nice. Again, you can also use a stratagem to get Ignore's cover and an extra pip of AP if you're in that Devastator Doctrine, which suddenly means that on any vehicle, unless it has an invuln, will just not be getting any kind of save against these guys. AP5 Ignore's cover. It's just ridiculous. So that gives them a serious boost, and there's also some enhancements in there that we're going to talk about later. And as well, Anvil Siege Force, this isn't one that gets talked about too much, but they have heavy on all of their melter guns, these guys, so getting that bonus +1 to wound is actually very, very strong. And I think it's always worth thinking about with Anvil Siege Force, just these little synergies that you can get out of it. It's a strange detachment, but one that people have a lot of love for, I think. So the real detachment, though, the kind of home of things with belter guns and flamer guns, is the Firestorm Assault Force detachment. There's some cool stuff going on for your Eradicators in this. Mainly, I think the detachment ability is just very, very good for them. So all models in this detachment have Assault. Really, really strong, because you just generally... Eradicators are very slow. And with that move 5, being able to add a d6 move to that and still be able to shoot is just very, very good. Not only does it allow you to just sort of get them into range of enemies where you might not otherwise be able to. If your opponent sort of pre-measures, oh, I'm 24 inches away from these guys, they're not going to be able to get a shot into them. But if you've got that advance, they can't really do that. And at the same time, +1 strength if the enemy unit is within 12. If these guys are coming in from reserve or hitting a big monster that's pushed up into your line, chances are it's going to be within 12. And get to add +1 to strength for the characteristic of that attack. Pretty good. These guys are only strength 9, so they can really suffer trying to fire into things like dreadnoughts and gladiator tanks, carnifexes, things like that. They're often hanging around that toughness 9, toughness 10 breakpoint, and this just means basically +1 to wound if you're within 12, which you want to be anyway. If you can get the melter rule going on these guys, then you're definitely cooking with gas, or melter, I suppose. So in terms of leaders, there's 2 that I want to talk about. The first one is a bit of a fall from grace, the Apothecary Biologist. Now this guy, when the edition came out, he was 50 something points. He was ridiculously cheap. And he was a bit people didn't really know what to make of him at first. He's a leader for gravis units, It gives his unit lethal hits, which is quite a strong ability. And then it also gives this little boost where if you kill something in melee, he gets a bunch of OC. So he basically starts out OCing entire battle line units at a certain point. Pretty good. And at such a cheap price point, he sort of started to wiggle his way into lists, specifically in the context of Gladius. Basically, you would slap this enhancement down here, Fire Discipline, on him, which gave his unit sustained hits. In the previous iteration of the game, it gave them critical hits on 5s if you're in the Devastator Doctrine. Now, this was absolutely heinous. People originally ran this on aggressors to give them loads of lethal hits on all their attacks. And that unit, if you used Oath, just the sheer volume of shots that they put through would just melt anything, especially considering you could stack AP on them as well. You know, you could shred Catan, you could bring down enemy tanks, you could blow up entire units. It was nuts. And as well as that, don't forget these ranged weapons. Again, a bit like with the ability, you get these kind of Overwatch shenanigans going on as well, where you just be able to hose enemy units that try to step out. And lethal hits, sustained hits, crit 5s. It was just nuts. So the whole package got nerfed. The Apothecary Biologist took a hit, went up to 70 points. The Fire Discipline at one point was like 45 points. And then finally it got reworked and then brought down in points later on. So now it only gives you reroll your advance rolls. So it's gone away, you know, it's not quite the same. But maybe there is still some point in taking the Apothecary Biologist and these Eradicators together. So the big thing here really is that Knights, they're just getting codexes now. If they become a really strong part of the game, there's already a lot of vehicles and monster mash kind of lists being spammed. If you're in a problem where you're like, oh, I'm being wrecked by Rogel Dawns and Bloodthirsters and Chaos Knights and things like that, I can genuinely see an argument for still taking the Apothecary Biologist and a big brick of 6 Eradicators. I don't think him and 3 of them is ever worth it because he's so many points compared to them. You might as well just try and shift some stuff around and get 2 units of Eradicators at that point. But if you get the Apothecary, big 6-man of Eradicators, it can just become a hammer that'll really sort of smash any vehicle that tries to push up into them. Especially Fire Discipline, maybe it's still worth taking. Lethal hits, sustained hits, it's pretty good to have that with all the rerolls that you get. And you could even, at a certain point, fish for those sustained lethals by just rerolling anything that's not a 6 in your shooting profile. It might genuinely pay off. And yeah, he's cheap enough at 70 points. You don't have to give him the enhancement. I think lethal hits on its own is just a good enough buff for Eradicators, just because they suffer from having that low strength. So this really just means that just more and more of their AP4 high value shots are just going to get through. And maybe in a vehicle monster heavy meta, this guy does genuinely have some play as a leader. And lastly, I just want, in terms of leaders, talk about Targadon. He's really, really cool. People tend to run him with the heavy intercessors, but I think in Eradicators he's actually quite solid. If you're trying to play around and have that like Imperial Fists sort of flavour, this guy can genuinely work in Eradicators. I think him and Lysander make a decent character package, and as soon as they do anything real about Ultramarines just being the best, it might be one of the ones that's worth considering. Now this guy, he's got some cool like gimmicks going on. He gives the Eradicators ignores cover, which is super relevant if they're shooting into 2-up save targets. Just, you know, taking your opponent from saving on 5s to 6s, really, really strong in terms of just making sure those high value shots get through. He gives them some melee heft, which is quite cool. Got that Hand of Defiance at strength 12. Just means that they're not going to get tagged up so lightly by your opponent. That is one of the weaknesses of Eradicators, is just if your opponent can get stuck in melee with them, they're not really the best at fighting their way out of it. But he does really coolly, this is a nice like weird synergy, he has this Artificer Grav Gun. It's a couple of shots, it hits on 2s. Anti-vehicle 2+, it's fine. The AP1 kind of lets it down. But he also gets this Siege Captain ability. If he hits a monster or a vehicle, which you want to be hitting with Eradicators anyway, he gets to improve the strength, attacks, strength, armor penetration, and damage characteristics of his attack by 2. So it suddenly becomes strength 7, AP 3, damage 4. Really, really nice. But still, it could be better. Don't forget though, Eradicators, their rule applies to their unit. which means Targadon will get those full hit and wound rerolls when he fires at a monster or vehicle. And it just suddenly takes him into like silly territory where he's just going to be able to do like 8 damage to random vehicles and monsters out of nowhere, which really like gives some consistency and some more shots to these Eradicators, even if you're in Overwatch. So yeah, it's always worth thinking about the Chin. He's a cool character. Just some final thoughts on Eradicators here and how I've been experiencing them. They are pretty good. Now, they are unreliable. It's weird. You'd think with full hit and wound rerolls and like the 4 shots and damage rerolls, they'd be good. But I've just found, for whatever weird reason, the amount of times I've brought these guys out, fired the whole squad into a vehicle, and it's been like the perfect scenario, they just whiff, you know, like, you just don't roll any 5s on the wound roll, despite it being like 8 chances, you know, between the rerolls and everything like that. Or your opponent just makes a 6-up save, and it's like, oh, I'll do damage, I'll roll the 2, or re-roll that, got a 3. And it's like your 100-point anti-tank unit has just done 3 damage. But at the same time, there's been other scenarios where they've stepped out and just been like, boom, that unit just takes 10 damage and it explodes. So, yeah, unreliable, which isn't the best. I think a lot of competitive players kind of stay away from that. Now, they do have struggle getting into position. I always like to have access to advance and charge when I'm running these guys. They don't have great transport options, being big gravis guys. You know, they can go in land raiders and repulsor executioners and repulsors and stuff. Like, maybe that's okay for them, but those tend to be almost like whole units onto themselves. So you're not necessarily wanting to transport your little unreliable unit of Eradicators around with that. However, I've got a friend who plays them in his Black Templars army as a bit of a kind of fire support anti-vehicle option, and they do great coming out of strategic reserves. It's just been good to give them that flexibility, and you avoid the kind of positioning issues that you might usually have. So that's been good to see that they've been having success over there. And it gets around like even needing the advance and shoot, perhaps, which, you know, since the Black Templars detachment doesn't have access to that, I guess that's like the necessity of using them in that, which has been really interesting to see. Personally, I tend to always run at least a little 3-man unit of Eradicators in my army. I just think if you deploy them late in the deployment phase, once you know where your opponent's vehicles are, you can kind of stage them appropriately. You can see in this game against Tau, there was a big Riptide on this flank. The Eradicators have been staged in the building on the bottom left, and they've finally, now that the Riptide's had to expose itself to contest an objective, the Eradicators have jumped out. And that's just really, really cool, yeah. They do good damage sometimes, they do no damage sometimes. It's a bit of a weird one. But I like the 3-man squad. Only 100 points, they're not too expensive. And they are, what's really, really good about them is they give your opponent something to think about when they want to just throw something into your lines. Because even though they might be a bit unreliable, in your opponent's head, they're never going to be that unreliable. You know, if you can step out, you know, if they want to charge their like big stompy knight into the middle of your army, you can sort of be like, well, you've got all these melter profiles just waiting there for that knight to just take 14 damage out of nowhere. So I think they're worth having. A little 100-man squad, 100-point squad. Oof. It'd be a bit expensive to take 100 Eradicators, but a little 100-point squad is never a bad thing. So thanks for watching anyway. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed. Try and produce more content like this every week. Bit of a rambly one, this one, but I feel like Eradicators are a bit like that. They're an odd unit. There's a lot of nuance to them, and they're not seen in the meta at all. They're sort of, it's been pushed out by the horrendously efficient Ballista Dreadnought, which is like only 140 points now, and the Gladiator Lancer, things like that. So I do think Eradicators have a place as kind of a more budget anti-tank option, but as in life, you get what you pay for.